The sun was low over Ridgeline Court when I opened my door and found her standing there, one hand wrapped around the worn black handle of my father's toolbox, the other balancing a glass dish still fogged with heat. I hadn't seen that toolbox in 2 years. I opened my mouth to ask her how, but she was already leaning in, her voice dropping just above a whisper. "I found this in my shed," she said, setting the box down between us. Then, closer, quieter, "I made extra dinner. I saved you some." I didn't know yet how much of that sentence was true, and how much of it was a door swinging open on hinges I hadn't oiled in years. My name is Julian Ashworth. I'm 38 years old, and I fix things for a living. Old chairs with loose joints, dressers that have outlived 3 families, tables that people swear they'll throw away until I convince them otherwise. I run my workshop out of the garage behind my house in Naperville, Illinois, on a street lined with maples that turn the color of rust every October. I've lived alone for 2 years now, ever since my marriage to a woman named Brianna Calloway ended in a courtroom that smelled like burnt coffee and cost us both more than either of us wanted to admit. We didn't have children. That, at least, made the leaving simpler, even if nothing else about it was. I should tell you about my father first, because everything that happened started with him, whether I understood that at the time or not. Robert Ashworth taught me how to plane a board before I could tie my own shoes properly. He built this workshop with his hands, laid the concrete himself, wired the lights himself, and when he died, he left it to me along with a toolbox he'd carried through 40 years of work, a black steel case with his initials, or A period, stamped into the lid. I used to think that toolbox was the most permanent thing in my life. Steadier than my marriage. Steadier than most people I knew. Then it disappeared. It happened somewhere in the chaos of moving out. Boxes stacked 3 deep in a rented storage unit. Half of them mine. Half of them things Brianna and I had never bothered to sort, because sorting them meant admitting the marriage was actually over. I told myself I'd go back for it. I never did. By the time I thought to look, months had passed, and some version of me had already decided it was gone the way a lot of things from that life were gone. Not stolen, not destroyed, just misplaced by 2 people who had stopped paying attention to each other's things at the exact moment it would have mattered most. So I built a life around its absence. Mornings started early, black coffee, a walk out to the workshop while the dew was still on the grass. I liked the sound of the planer more than I liked most conversations. I liked the smell of sawdust and old varnish, the particular quiet of a house with no one else in it to disturb anything. It wasn't a sad life. I want to be clear about that, because I know how it sounds, a divorced man alone in a garage with his dead father's tools. It wasn't sad. It was just quiet, in the specific way a life gets quiet once you've stopped expecting much else from it. 2 houses down, a woman moved in on a Tuesday in early spring. I noticed the moving truck before I noticed her, a rented one, backed carelessly into the driveway, boxes labeled in neat black marker. New neighbors came and went on Ridgeline Court the way they do on any street where people are either just starting out or just starting over. I remember thinking she looked like the second kind. Steady hands carrying boxes that were clearly heavier than they looked. No hurry to her, even when one of them slipped. I didn't introduce myself that week. That wasn't unusual for me. I'd gone longer than that without meeting neighbors who'd lived there for years. But Deacon Ray, who's lived across the street since before I was born and appointed himself the unofficial mayor of our stretch of houses, made it his business to know everyone within a month of their arrival. He mentioned her to me once, leaning on my mailbox with the patience of a man who has nowhere else to be. Said her name was Josephine. Said she worked with antiques or old furniture, something like that. He wasn't entirely sure, and I didn't ask him to be. It wasn't a detail I filed away as important. I had no reason to think it was. I went back to my routine, the coffee, the workshop, the quiet. And if you'd told me then that the woman 2 doors down already knew more about my father's toolbox than I did, I would have laughed you off my porch. But that's the thing about the life I was living. I thought I understood all its edges. I thought silence meant nothing was happening. I was wrong about that, in ways I wouldn't understand for months. The evening she brought the toolbox back changed the rhythm of my week without my noticing right away. 2 days later, she was at my door again, this time with a loaf of bread wrapped in a checkered towel, saying something about having baked too much and not wanting it to go to waste. I believed her, the way you believe most small kindnesses, without examining them too closely. I invited her in for coffee. She said yes. That became the pattern. Some evenings it was her, standing on my porch with a plate covered in foil. Some evenings it was me, walking the 2 houses down with a toolbox of my own, not my father's, my everyday one, because her back door stuck in the humidity, or her kitchen faucet dripped all night, or a hinge on her garden gate had rusted itself into complaining. I liked fixing things for her. There was a simplicity to it that I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. The kind of usefulness that doesn't ask anything of you except your hands and your attention. We never talked about work, not really. She called me the guy with the workshop, said it like a nickname she'd chosen on purpose, and I called her the new neighbor even after she'd stopped being new by any reasonable measure. I knew she left early some mornings and came home smelling faintly of old wood polish, the way I imagined an antique shop might smell, but I never asked her to spell it out for me, and she never offered. It wasn't that either of us was hiding something on purpose, or so I told myself. It was just that some conversations felt unnecessary when the silence between us was already comfortable enough to live in. I noticed things about her instead. The way she listened when I talked about my father, leaning forward slightly, asking questions that showed she'd actually been paying attention the last time I mentioned him, not just waiting for her turn to speak. The way she never rushed me through a story, even when I circled back twice to say the same thing a different way. The way her hand would rest a beat too long on the doorframe when she said goodnight, like she was deciding whether to say something else and choosing not to. Some mornings I'd catch her out on her porch before either of us had said a word, coffee cup in hand, watching the street wake up the same slow way I did. And there was something in that shared quiet that felt more honest than most conversations I'd ever had with anyone. One evening in late April, I was showing her how to sand down a warped drawer front she'd picked up somewhere, and she ran her fingers along the grain the way someone does when they already know what they're touching. "You have a feel for this," I said, half a compliment, half a question. "I've spent a lot of time around wood that's been loved for a long time," she said. "You pick things up." It should have told me more than it did. I let it pass the way I let most things pass that spring, because I liked the shape our evenings had taken, and I didn't want to poke at it too hard. There was a night in May I still think about, when the neighborhood held its early summer block party out on the shared green at the end of the street. Somebody strung up lights between 2 oaks, somebody else brought a grill, and the whole street smelled like charcoal and cut grass. Joe and I ended up sitting on the curb together, away from the crowd, plates balanced on our knees, and for a moment she started to say something that felt like it was heading somewhere important. "There's a reason I ended up on this street," she began, and then stopped herself, looking down at her plate like she'd surprised even herself with how close she'd come to finishing the sentence. I asked her a reason like what. She just shook her head, smiled the way she always smiled when she wanted a subject to end, and said something about liking the trees. I let it go. I've replayed that curb 100 times since, wondering how different everything might have been if I'd simply waited her out that night, instead of changing the subject for her. Deacon didn't share my restraint. He caught me in the driveway one Saturday morning, coffee in hand, wearing the expression he always wore right before he said something he considered helpful and I considered nosy. "You know," he said, nodding toward her house, "that girl was asking around about your dad's old shop before she even moved in. Asked me a few things about the workshop, about your father, weeks before the truck showed up." I laughed it off. Told him plenty of people asked questions about the neighborhood before they bought a house. It was practically required, these days, to research where you were about to spend your savings. He shrugged, said he supposed that was true, and went back to his newspaper. I didn't think about it again that day, or the next, but it lodged somewhere, the way small things do when they don't quite fit the story you've already written for yourself. I found myself watching her a little differently after that, not with suspicion, not yet, but with a kind of attention I hadn't been paying before. I noticed how carefully she avoided certain questions. Where exactly she'd worked in Chicago. What exactly had made her choose this particular street? Out of every street, in every suburb within an hour of the city. She had answers. Always smooth ones. But they were the kind of answers that told you just enough to stop asking. I told myself it didn't matter. Everyone carries a version of their past they'd rather smooth over before handing it to someone new. I certainly had mine. An entire marriage I'd learned to summarize in 2 sentences so people would stop asking follow-up questions. I figured she had her own version of that. I figured it wasn't my business to pry it open. What I didn't figure, what I couldn't have figured, was that her carefulness wasn't about protecting herself from a painful past. It was about protecting something else entirely, a truth she wasn't ready to hand me yet, wrapped so carefully in ordinary explanations that I mistook the wrapping for the whole gift. By June, we'd fallen into something that felt, from the inside, like the beginning of trust. She knew which mug I preferred without asking anymore. I knew she took her coffee black, same as me, and that she always paused before answering a question about her family, like she was deciding how much of the truth the moment could hold. We didn't talk about the toolbox again after that first night. It sat on a shelf in my workshop, cleaned and oiled, exactly where my father's tools had always belonged, and I let myself believe the strangeness of its return was simply luck, a good thing that had happened to me for no complicated reason at all. Looking back, I can see all the places where the truth was standing right in front of me, patient, waiting for me to ask one more question than I did. The way she never once seemed surprised by anything my father's old workshop held. The way she'd run her fingers over a signature carved into the underside of a table leg one evening and gone quiet for a beat too long before saying something ordinary to cover it. I noticed these things the way you notice a draft in an old house, a small unease you learn to live around instead of tracing to its source. I wasn't a careless man by nature. I was a man who had decided, somewhere after the divorce, that peace was worth more than certainty, and that trade had made me slower than I should have been to ask the questions that mattered. I was 38 years old, and I had convinced myself I understood the difference between a coincidence and a choice. I was about to learn how wrong a person can be about that, and how long a kind lie can hold together before the world decides it's had enough of holding it for you. Brianna came back on a Thursday in late June, and I want to say I saw it coming, but the truth is I didn't see any of it coming. Not the timing, not the anger, not the way she stood on my porch like she still had a right to be there. I'd heard, distantly, secondhand through people who still ran in the same circles we used to share, that there was some kind of buzz building around my father's furniture. An anonymous appraisal piece had circulated in a trade publication that spring, singling out several pieces built by a craftsman from central Illinois whose work, the article argued, deserved far more recognition than it had ever gotten while he was alive. I hadn't read it myself. I don't move in those circles, never had the patience for them. But apparently Brianna did, or at least someone close to her did, because she showed up at my door holding a printed copy of it, her face flushed with something between excitement and outrage. "Do you know what this is worth now?" she said, before I'd even fully opened the door. She meant the furniture. Several pieces of my father's work had gone to her in the divorce settlement, split down the middle along with everything else we'd built and unbuilt together. At the time, none of it had seemed particularly valuable, sentimental, maybe, but not the kind of thing either of us fought over. Apparently that had changed. I told her I hadn't seen the article. She pushed past that, talking fast, saying she wanted to sell the rest of what she had, the pieces she'd kept in storage since the divorce, and that she needed my signature on something, some clause about provenance she didn't fully explain and I didn't fully understand. I told her I'd look at it. I told her I wasn't interested in fighting about furniture 2 years after we'd finished fighting about everything else. That's when she noticed the house 2 doors down. Jo was outside, on her own porch, watering a row of plants in the late afternoon light. I don't know exactly what gave it away. Maybe it was the way Brianna's eyes moved from the article in her hand to Jo's house and back again, some instinct clicking into place. She asked me, too casually, who my neighbor was. I told her, the guy with the workshop version of the truth I'd been living in for months. New neighbor. Nice. Helps me out sometimes. Brianna's expression changed in a way I didn't like. That's not just some neighbor, Julian, she said. I know that name. Josephine Hartwell. She's the one who wrote that article. She's an appraiser, a good one, from what I hear. People in that world talk about her. I stood there for a second, feeling something shift under my feet that I couldn't yet name. I told Brianna she was mistaken, that Jo worked with old furniture. Sure, restoration maybe, nothing more specific than that, because that was all I actually knew, and saying it out loud made me realize for the first time how little that actually was. She's not just working with old furniture, Brianna said, and there was something almost triumphant in her voice now, the tone of someone who has just found a weapon and intends to use it properly. She's the person who decided your father's name was worth writing about. And she just happens to live 2 doors down from the one piece nobody's found yet, the toolbox with his initials on it. You think that's a coincidence? I told her to leave. I told her whatever business she had with me could go through a lawyer, the way everything else between us had gone through a lawyer, and that I wasn't going to stand on my own porch and let her turn my neighbor into a villain based on a guess. My voice came out steadier than I felt, and some old, tired part of me recognized the shape of this fight. Brianna reaching for the sharpest thing in the room the moment she felt she was losing ground, the same instinct that had worn our marriage down long before either of us admitted it out loud. But the guess had already found its way under my skin, and Brianna knew it. She could always tell when a thing had landed, even in the years we were married, and she left with a kind of satisfaction that told me this wasn't really about the furniture at all, not entirely. It was about planting something and walking away before she had to watch it grow, the way she'd always been better at starting fires than putting them out. I didn't sleep well that night. I sat in the workshop long after dark, the overhead light humming its usual hum, and I kept running the timeline back in my head, all the small details that had never quite added up. Deacon's comment in the driveway, the way Joe always steered conversations away from her work in Chicago, the ease with which she'd known exactly how to sand that warped drawer front, the comfort in her hands around old wood that went deeper than casual interest, the unfinished sentence on the curb in May that I'd let her swallow instead of pressing for the rest of it. Each memory, taken alone, had seemed harmless enough at the time. Stacked together in the quiet of that workshop, they read like a woman who had known exactly what she was walking into long before I ever opened my door to her. I thought about the toolbox sitting on my workshop shelf, and for the first time since the night she'd handed it to me, I looked at it differently. Not as a gift, as a piece of evidence I hadn't wanted to examine too closely, sitting there under the same light my father used to work by, as if even he were waiting to hear what I'd decide. The walk to her porch the next evening felt longer than 2 houses worth of sidewalk had any right to feel. I kept rehearsing the question in different orders, trying to find a version of it that didn't sound like an accusation, and failing every time. I found her on her porch, watering the same row of plants Brianna had seen her tending the day before, and I didn't plan what I was going to say in the end. I just asked her, directly, whether she'd known about my father's furniture before she moved here. Whether the toolbox really had turned up in her shed by accident, the way she'd told me that first evening, or whether there was more to it than that. She didn't answer right away, and in the space where an answer should have been, I felt something in my chest go quiet in the worst possible way. The particular silence of a person deciding how much of the truth they're finally ready to lose control of. Julian, she said finally, it's not what you think. But it's also not nothing. Can I explain it properly? Not out here. I told her I needed a minute. I told her I'd come by the next day. I walked back to my own house feeling like a man who'd just realized the floor he'd been standing on for months was never as solid as he'd believed, and I didn't know yet whether what came next would be a confession that broke us or one that finally let something honest begin. She came to my workshop the next evening instead of waiting for me to come to her, which I understood later was its own kind of courage. I was standing at the bench when she walked in, and she didn't sit down. She stood across from me the way you stand when you've decided not to give yourself an easy way to look away from something. 18 months ago, she said, I saw a chair you'd restored at a charity auction outside Chicago. I didn't know your name then. I just knew the work was extraordinary, the kind of joinery you don't see anymore, the kind that tells you someone cared about a piece of furniture nobody else would have bothered saving. I found the small workshop page you kept online. I read through it more times than I should probably admit. I started following your restorations the way some people follow a person they've never met but feel like they understand anyway. I didn't say anything. I let her keep going, because stopping her felt like it would break whatever fragile thing had brought her here to finally say it. 8 months ago, I heard the house where your ex-wife had been keeping storage was being cleared out for an estate sale. I went, mostly out of curiosity, and I found a toolbox with the initials R and A stamped into the lid. I recognized the name from things I'd read about your father, a few old newspaper mentions, a regional woodworking magazine from years back. I bought it that day, not because I needed it, because I couldn't stand the thought of it disappearing into a stranger's garage with no one left who understood what it meant. You bought it, I repeated, 7 months before you handed it to me and told me you found it in your shed. I know how that sounds, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word no. I moved here 5 months ago, on purpose, because I found out the house 2 doors from yours had gone up for sale, and I couldn't stop thinking about being close to the man who'd made the work I'd been quietly admiring for over a year. That part is true. The part about the shed, that was true too, in the smallest, most technical way. I did find it in my shed, the day I unpacked, because I'd put it there myself the week I moved in. I just let you believe I meant something else by it. I let the truth do less work than it should have. I stood there holding the weight of all of it, the timeline, the choices, the months of careful silence between us that I'd mistaken for simple friendship building slowly into something more. Part of me wanted to be angry, and for a moment I was. But another part of me, quieter, was doing the arithmetic of everything she'd actually done since that first evening. The meals, the mended faucet, the hours in this workshop asking real questions and listening to real answers. None of it had felt like a woman working an angle. It had felt, every single time, like a woman who had nothing to gain and was giving anyway, who had shown up on ordinary Tuesdays with nothing to offer but her time, long before either of us had a reason to call it anything more than kindness between neighbors. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked. "From the beginning. Why the whole story about the shed?" "Because I was terrified you'd hear it the way your ex-wife is going to make you hear it," she said. "That I found you because of what your father's work is worth. That I engineered all of it for some kind of return. I needed you to know me first. I needed you to trust the version of me that fixed your neighbor's faucet before you ever heard the version of me that studies old furniture for a living." She reached into the bag she'd been carrying and set 2 papers on my workbench. One was a letter, formally worded, declining to have her name attached publicly to the appraisal article that had started all of this. She'd written it, she explained, the week the piece went to print, insisting on anonymity even then, long before she had any reason to think it would matter to me. The other was a receipt, dated the same week, redirecting every dollar of the article's fee to a small nonprofit dedicated to preserving regional woodworking history. I read both of them twice. There was nothing in either one that a person builds for show. They were the kind of paperwork nobody keeps unless they were never planning to use it as an alibi. "I don't need you to forgive this tonight," she said quietly. "I just needed you to have the whole truth, finally, instead of the parts one decided you could handle." I called Brianna the following morning. I told her the toolbox wasn't hers to claim, wasn't hers to sell, and never had been. My father's will had been explicit about it, a detail she'd apparently forgotten or chosen not to remember, leaving his tools specifically to his son, not to whoever his son happened to be married to at the time. I told her whatever she decided to do with the furniture she still owned was her business, but that the toolbox and the man standing in the workshop it came from were no longer subjects open for her commentary. Then I went back to Joe, and I set the toolbox down on the bench between us, the same way she had set it down on my porch months earlier. Not as evidence this time. Not as a question either of us needed answered anymore. As a beginning we were finally allowed to have honestly. 3 months later, we opened the workshop doors under a new sign neither of us had planned to make official so quickly. Ashworth and Hartwell, hand-lettered on a board I'd cut myself, with Joe laughing that it looked crooked and me telling her that was the point, that nothing my father ever built was perfectly straight either. She handled the appraisals and the sourcing, tracking down old wood and forgotten pieces with an instinct I still didn't fully understand and had stopped needing to. I handled what I'd always handled, restoring the things worth saving, one joint and one drawer front at a time. We didn't rush anything, and I think that was the part that surprised me most. After everything that had come out that summer, I expected some kind of urgency between us, some need to prove the relationship was real by moving fast. Instead, it felt like the opposite. We'd already spent months building trust the slow way, without either of us fully realizing what we were building toward, and once the truth was finally out in the open, there was nothing left to rush. We just kept doing what we'd already been doing. Dinners that no longer needed an excuse, evenings in the workshop that stretched later than either of us intended, conversations that didn't skirt around anything anymore. There was a Saturday that autumn, maybe 5 months after the night in the workshop, when Joe dragged home a battered writing desk she'd found at an estate sale 2 counties over, insisting it had good bones under all that water damage. We spent an entire weekend on it together, stripping old varnish, replacing a split leg, and somewhere in the middle of that work she finally told me, without my having to ask, about the curb at the block party in May. the sentence she'd swallowed that night. I was going to tell you everything right there, she admitted, sanding a corner she didn't need to sand. I lost my nerve watching the fireflies instead. I told her I was glad she'd waited, in the end, because I don't think either of us would have believed it yet. Not that early, not before we'd earned each other the slow way. She looked at me like that was the exact answer she'd been hoping for. 8 months after that first night on my porch, a regional craft guild put together a small exhibition honoring Illinois woodworkers whose work had shaped the trade over the past half-century. My father's name was on the list, alongside men and women I'd only ever heard about secondhand from him, growing up. Jo helped curate the display. She insisted, over my objections, that the toolbox be part of it, set behind glass with a small card explaining whose hands had carried it for 40 years. I stood in front of that case longer than I meant to, on opening night, watching people I'd never met stop and read my father's name and nod the way people do when they recognize real craftsmanship, even secondhand. Jo found me there eventually, slipping her hand into mine without saying anything at first, just standing beside me the way she'd learned to do months earlier, when words weren't the thing a moment needed. "Do you ever regret trusting me?" she asked, quietly, once the crowd around us had thinned. I thought about it honestly before I answered, because she deserved an honest answer, not a quick one. I thought about that first evening on the porch, the smell of the dinner she'd carried over, the weight of the toolbox in my hands before I understood what carrying it had cost her to finally hand over. I thought about every version of the truth she could have told me faster, and every reason she'd had for waiting until she was sure I'd hear it the right way. "I only regret the 7 months I didn't know you were standing right next to me," I said. "Everything after that, I'd choose again." She smiled the way she'd smiled that very first evening on my porch, before either of us understood what we were starting, and squeezed my hand. The workshop looks different now than it did 2 years ago, though the bones of it are the same. My father's workbench still sits against the back wall. The same lights still hum overhead in the evenings. But there's a second set of hands in it now, a second set of ideas, a second voice filling the quiet I'd once mistaken for contentment. Some nights we work in silence, standing side by side, and some nights she tells me about a piece she's tracked down 3 states away, her whole face lighting up the way it does when she's found something worth saving. I've learned to recognize that look. I've learned it usually means we're about to spend a weekend driving somewhere neither of us has been, chasing a story neither of us knew existed a week earlier. By the time the first snow came that winter, the shop had settled into a rhythm of its own. Customers who'd started asking for both of us by name, a waiting list for restorations that stretched further than either of us had expected, and a small brass bell over the door that Jo insisted on hanging herself, standing on a stepladder while I held it steady and told her, more than once, that I could have done it faster alone. She told me that wasn't the point. I understood what she meant before she finished the sentence. Some things aren't about speed. Some things are about doing them together, even when together takes longer. Deacon still leans on my mailbox some mornings, coffee in hand, pretending he isn't pleased with himself for being the one who first mentioned her name to me. He likes to remind me, every few months, that he was the one who told me she'd been asking questions before the truck even showed up, as though he'd known the whole shape of the story back when it was still just a rumor over a fence. I let him take the credit. It's easier than explaining the whole truth, and besides, in his own roundabout way, he wasn't wrong to notice her before I did. He just didn't know yet how much noticing there was still left to do. The toolbox still comes home with us most evenings, back on its shelf, oiled and cared for the way my father always kept it. It isn't a mystery anymore. It isn't a question I'm afraid to ask, or an answer I'm afraid to hear. It's just a toolbox now, sitting exactly where it belongs, in a workshop that finally has enough love in it to match all the years of work that built it, and enough room left over for whatever we decide to build in it next. I think about that first evening more often than I probably should. The two of us standing at my door, the light going gold behind her, that box between us holding more history than either of us understood yet. I used to think the lie in that moment was the part that mattered. Now I know it was the smallest part of the whole story. The truth underneath it, the one she was too afraid to hand me all at once, turned out to be worth every bit of the weight. She didn't hand me back a toolbox that evening. She handed me a reason to believe I was still worth finding, even after I'd quietly stopped expecting anyone to look. I think about how easily I could have let Brianna's suspicion win that summer, how close I came to choosing certainty over the harder, better things sitting right in front of me. I'm grateful, most nights, that I didn't. My father spent his whole life teaching me that anything worth keeping needs to be looked after carefully, examined for cracks before you trust it to hold weight. I just never expected that lesson to apply to a person instead of a piece of furniture, and I never expected the person to be the one standing 2 doors down the entire time. So I'll ask you the same 2 questions I've been asking myself ever since. Do you believe a small, harmless lie can sometimes be the opening line of something honest? And if you found out your new neighbor had quietly noticed you long before you ever noticed them, would it feel like love, or would it feel like something you needed to be afraid of? If this story found its way to you tonight, leave a like, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me in the comments, should Julian have forgiven her the moment she told the truth, or should Jo have had to prove herself a little longer first?